Big economic story of the day. That's the Trump administration's decision to slap a 25% tariff on over 1,000 Chinese goods. Those goods range from washing machines to aircraft tires. Here's what President Trump had to say earlier today.
We're putting tariffs on $50 billion worth of technology and other things because we have to, because we've been treated very unfairly. But China's been terrific. President Xi has been terrific. President Moon, everybody, we're all working together because of me.
Mr. President,
Well, joining us from Washington, D.C. is a former ambassador to China, Stapleton Roy. He's the founding director also of the Kissinger Institute on China and the U.S. But let's first begin in with studio with our economy correspondent, Asher Westropp-Evans. And Asher, just let's look a little more deeply into that statement by the U.S. on these tariffs.
So we've seen some very interesting statements come out today. We already know the story of what's happening here, but what the interesting case that we're going to look at is what's going to move forward from here. So the U.S. came out with this statement earlier in the day, in which they stated that the United States will pursue additional tariffs if China engages in retaliatory measures, such as imposing new tariffs on U.S. goods and services. Now, this is a particularly interesting statement because, again, later on in the day, we had China come out with their response in which they stated that China does not want to fight a trade war. However, in the face of short-sighted behavior by the United States, they will immediately introduce taxation measures on the same scale and same strength, and implied that all other previous agreements are now invalidated.
All right, well, let's go to Washington now. Mr. Ambassador, first of all, just let me get your reaction to this latest move by the Trump administration. Are we looking at a full-blown trade war with China?
We're looking at an unprecedented situation. We have not really seen in many decades a tariff-driven trade war between two major trading countries such as the United States and China at the same time that we are engaged in a tariff potential trade war with our European allies and with our neighbors, Canada and Mexico. So nobody's quite certain what the outcome of this will be.
You know, I have to say, though, from the Chinese perspective, it's very difficult for anything they do to have any teeth. Because if you look at what they do right now, they actually already impose tariffs on a number of American products. And I'm going to give you cars, for example, a 25% import tax on American-made cars, whereas the U.S. only imposes a 2.5% tax on cars made in China. So my question for you is, does China really have any ability to retaliate in this conversation today?
Well, I think you will find that the Chinese can retaliate in ways that will damage particular interest groups in the United States, such as our agricultural exporters, many of whom depend heavily on agricultural exports to China. But we also need to step back a moment. The full $50 billion does not weigh in immediately. It's going to be 25% on $34 billion of goods, and those won't begin until July 6th. So these are going to be phased in other words. Secondly, this seems to be a tit-for-tat type of potential escalation. We say we're going to impose $50 billion or 25% tariffs on $50 billion of Chinese goods eventually. Chinese say they will retaliate on the same scale. We say that we'll retaliate against Chinese retaliation. Where is this going to lead? Now, there's an additional conceptual problem. I have not seen economic theory that explains how you benefit from putting a tax on the American consumer because of the improper behavior of a major foreign trading organization.
Well, Asher, to that point,
because ultimately a tariff on consumer goods coming into the United States amounts to a tax increase for the American consumer.
Okay. Asher, I just want to look at the timing of the announcement by the Trump administration. It's almost as if they're saying, well, okay, North Korea, that's behind us now. We don't need China so much. Now we can crack down on this, on China's trade practices.
Absolutely right. And Trump has taken great care to state that he's got North Korea underhand. He feels very comfortable that he has the North Korea situation involved, and he feels he doesn't need China to use that sort of leverage that he had previously wanted to keep them on side for, and perhaps some in his administration are being more moved around to that position. I mean, we've seen varied opinions with Steve Mnuchin, for example, Treasury Secretary, calling for more sort of more dovish approach to this international trade versus Wilbur Ross, for example, who seems, Commerce Secretary, more willing to take on these hawkish and protectionist measures.
Mr. Ambassador, you served in China. You've dealt face-to-face with Chinese officials. If you're criticizing this strategy by the Trump administration, what could work, if anything, to get them to change some of their trade practices?
That's a very good question. But first of all, let's put it in context. We have really four upfront issues with China at the present time. One, of course, is what we consider their fair trade practices. And the tariffs that the president proposes to put on them is designed to deal with that. Secondly, we have the Taiwan problem. The U.S. Congress unanimously passed a non-binding bill that would essentially, if implemented the way the bill is drafted, gut a key element of our one China policy. The president signed that bill without a signing statement. So that potentially could create a crisis in U.S.-China relations related to Taiwan. We have the North Korean nuclear issue. We've just had a successful summit between the two leaders in Singapore, and China, I think, is pleased with the outcome because they did not want to see a growing crisis between the United States and North Korea. And we have the South China Sea issue, in which our two militaries are sparring with each other down there. So if you look at all of these issues in context, the most dangerous is really the Taiwan issue, not the trade issue. We had vicious trade disputes with the Japanese back in the late 1980s, and yet the U.S.-Japan alliance remained strong because we weren't toying with the fundamentals of the relationship. The same thing applies to the U.S.-China relationship. We can have a vicious trade war with China, and that still will not undermine the basis for the relationship. But if we begin to toy with the one China policy, then we are risking a genuine breakdown in the relationship between the United States and China. So the Trump administration has to be careful in calibrating which of the issues is getting greater attention and is more threatening to the underlying relationship.
All right. Well, this is a Chinese puzzle, quite difficult to figure as you laid it out.